So, good morning, everyone. Hi, and welcome to 2025. I'm Avantika Goswami from the Climate Change Program at CSC, and I'm joined here by my colleague Tushant Dev. And we're super excited to have a really good friend of ours, possibly like mentor, inspiration, Tim Sahay, here from the Net Zero Industrial Policy Lab at Johns Hopkins University. Tim is also the co-editor of the Polycrisis magazine hosted at Phenomenal World, which deals with the political economy of climate. And he's just all-round multifaceted and very knowledgeable person about all things climate and politics. So great to have you here with us. Welcome to New Delhi amidst our unfortunate AQI, which I wish it was under better conditions. But we wanted to have this conversation mainly because we love hearing you speak, but also to kind of set the tone for 2025 in a sense, which is putting a lot of pressure on this one conversation. But it's important to really contextualize everything that's happening in the world in the backdrop of the climate crisis. So we are not on track to achieve the Paris Agreement's goals. We may have crossed the 1.5 C threshold in certain individual years recently. 2024 was the hottest year on record. At the same time, the paradox and contradiction here is that countries are announcing new climate targets. The latest round of NDCs have started to be rolled out. But this is happening in the backdrop of increasing fossil fuel production and consumption. And a lot of that is completely at odds with one another. Global renewable penetration has increased. We generated about 30% of global power from renewable sources in 2023. But at the same time, coal, oil, and gas are not on the decline at a pace that we need them to be. Coal, in particular, the outlook from the IEA recently suggests that coal consumption globally actually rose in 2024 and is likely to stay at the same levels till 2027, and then peak and decline eventually, but quite late. Oil and gas, the major producers, the United States, Russia, Saudi Arabia, they are bullish in their outlook. While some of their demand for oil, particularly, is being eaten into right now by increasing electrification of the transport sector, they are betting heavily on growing demand in the Asian countries, as well as particular sectors like petrochemicals to actually soak up some of their production. So there's all of these competing trends that are characterizing the climate policy landscape right now. And this is just on the green stuff and the not so green stuff. If you also start looking at what's happening in geopolitics, in global economic policy, things are kind of a mess. You not only have two major conflicts going on in the world, one of which is a genocide, you also have an escalating economic and trade war with developed countries trying to counter the threat of China with escalating tariffs, with huge domestic subsidies, with this focus away from multilateralism and more towards smaller, friendlier coalition building in an era where there's escalating climate impacts, escalating environmental impacts. Air pollution is a huge problem for Indian cities right now. So, how do we make sense of it all? How do we derive some semblance of hope for 2025? So with that, I think I'll throw my first question to you, which came in from one of our subscribers who submitted a question. What is the Polycrisis? You talk a lot about it, and it's the name of one of your publications. And how does it really influence what we're trying to do on climate policy?
I mean, firstly, that was a really, really good introduction to the polycrisis. So I mean, just the way you laid it out, right? Like, polycrisis is trying to be attentive to the current set of crises that have erupted in the world since the pandemic. The pandemic being an ecological crisis, a health crisis that killed 20, 30 million people, and that crisis of health created enormous response from governments. So they started to spend money into people's pockets to basically stay at home. If you're going to stay at home, you can't work, and that created an enormous level of welfare crises. Right, developing countries said we don't have the money to put into people's pockets. Rich countries did borrow money to put money into people's pockets. And the result of that kind of spending and that sudden lockdown was a supply chain crisis. And that supply chain crisis meant that all of a sudden you ran out of milk powder, you ran out of oil, oil prices went negative. And so you had a supply chain crisis, which then created inflation. So what we wanted to look at was this set of intersecting crises that smash into one another and create bigger problems than that initial individual crisis. And the kinds of responses by governments have also been like, hey, we can't just solve one crisis at a time. At the same time as we have a supply chain crisis, war, we also have the climate crisis going on. So if we're going to be suddenly going to be spending money into people's pockets and keeping industries afloat through the pandemic, we also want to help them go green at the same time.
Yeah.
So almost all of the legislative bills that countries, whether they're India, whether they're Brazil, whether they're the US or Europe did, had this mix of elements in them. Let's try and solve the climate crisis. Let's put money into people's pockets. Nobody has a job anymore, so let's solve the jobs crisis at the same time. So we basically realized that there was a new way in which governments were looking at the problem and the way that the world itself was throwing problems to solve. And we basically felt that most of us were unprepared or unknowledgeable to unpack how these things relate to one another. And so we said, okay, let's just do some joined up thinking. Let's just go from one to the next and actually keep the climate crisis maybe not front and center, but to the side and see how the things that people in the climate world, at CSE, you've been working on this for the last 30, 40 years. And what have people been saying about the climate crisis? Well, it's a fight between rich and poor. It's a fight between North and South. It's a fight about technology, green technologies, old industrial technologies. And we need to think about the transfer of money. We need to think about the transfer of technology, the transfer of resources. And all of these get hurt if you have a geopolitical crisis, an inflation crisis, a debt crisis. So we said, okay, let's actually see what the climate problems and climate solutions are going to look like in the world now, not in some kind of frozen policy landscape of 1990 or 2000, but in the 2020s.
Yeah. No, and I love that because, historically, a lot of the climate movement has been extremely top down, and there's been these narratives that have built up specifically within the UNFCCC. It's mitigation versus adaptation. You name and shame countries for not, putting 55% emission cut as opposed to putting just like 50%. Like, it's been a lot of that kind of high level rhetoric, but I think what you and your cohort really try to do is break it down into what it is essentially is a real economy problem. And if you talk about countries like India and so much of the developing world, I mean, we're feeling climate impacts, but we have so many other competing priorities that are just shifting our attention from solely focusing on decarbonization.
Right.
But you have to decarbonize. So that's really the
And
contradiction.
I'll just sort of give one quick example of Sri Lanka. So that if you go to our website, our magazine's website, Polycrisis, at Phenomenal World, we have this image of a riot in Sri Lanka, but this guy is holding a piece of bread. There's no food to eat. A guy behind him has got a petrol rag on fire, saying there's no petrol. We can't fill up our petrol. We are queuing up at the petrol pump. Then he's wearing a mask. There's still the pandemic, killing thousands of people a day. And the whole demonstration is in front of the central bank in Sri Lanka. There's no dollars. We're in a dollar debt crisis. Sri Lanka's just run out of money to pay for that food, to pay for that energy. And that's not something abstract. That is very real. Hungry people, dying people, people without money in their pockets, all at the same time as you have this crunching global debt crisis.
Yeah.
Where a country like Sri Lanka, countries like Bangladesh, Pakistan, all these countries around India have had tremendous political economic crises just in the last 2 years.
Right. And yeah, we're seeing a lot of that in a sense, maybe slowing the transition. Another curveball that's kind of throwing a wrench in the works, Trump 2.0. And I'm sure you get asked this question quite a lot. Trump 2.0 may not be like Trump 1.0. I feel like certain things may have changed. Biden did made some interesting policy choices with the IRA, which actually, as you've pointed out time and again, has won over many Republican districts or states or parts of the US. But what does it all mean? Does the second Trump administration look like it's going to torpedo US and global decarbonization? Will the world still go ahead? What are your expectations?
First thing is, no one knows anything. I mean, I don't think Trump knows himself. It's just the last chap that he talks to. But with Trump, the main thing is actually just that he's an uncertainty machine. Is he going to stop people from coming across the borders? Is he going to slap new tariffs on the entire global economy? Is he going to deport 10 million people and completely throw the US economy into a tailspin? Who's going to work in agriculture? Who's going to work in the hospitals? Who's going to take care of kids if millions of people are thrown out of the country? So he's just an uncertainty machine, and everybody is recalculating, recalibrating what they should be doing to anticipate his policy. So the first thing is just uncertainty creates paralysis, right? People don't know what to expect. They stop investing. So they get scared, or they make changes to their life plans. So that's I think the first thing to concentrate on. The second thing is he's said very clearly what he wants to do. He wants to deport people. He wants to throw up tariffs and say, basically, foreigners are screwing Americans, so we want to screw them back. So we're going to put a tariff on all of you, and that's going to create jobs inside America. That's what he claims he wants to do. And then the third thing he's very consistent on, I want to end the Green New scam, right? He just doesn't believe that green environmental investment is good for America, good for Americans, good for workers. He just doesn't believe that. It's a scam. It's not real. And if it is real, other people are screwing us over. So the Chinese are still burning coal. Why should we be going green? That's the kind of thing that he's been saying. But at the same time, while Trump was president, 2016 to 2020, two very important things happened. Coal went down in the US, solar went up. Solar and wind went up. Does that matter who's the president, or is there a broader political economic change happening in the world economy where green technologies are becoming A, cheaper, B, zones of great power conflict?
Yes.
So when he says, I want to fight back against China and I'm going to throw up these tariff walls against China, which he did in 2016, 2017, that still resulted in an enormous amount of trade with China. Right? So it's not clear that you can actually stop certain types of things from happening if there are American consumers and American firms that still want to do business with China. They'll find a way around these policies. So that's the second element of what Trump means, is people have options. They find ways around the problem. And so we are going to find a lot of reaction to Trump from other countries, from other companies inside the US, to try and find ways around it. And I think the third thing that we really need to think about with Trump is he says he's going to slow down the climate and energy transition. I'm going to end the Green New Deal, so the IRA. So I'm just going to remove all of these subsidies. They're all useless. But what's actually going to happen is that the Republicans in Congress, they have a majority in both the lower house and the upper house, in the House and the Senate. But so you could think, well, he could do whatever he wants. If the party says we're going to end it, we're going to end it. But the problem is, as you pointed out, the IRA has created a lot of winners. 80% of the money of the climate investment has gone to Republican districts and states. So those people, those MPs are going to stand up and say, wait a second, I'm not going to end this bill that is helping my constituents. And if just 5 to 10 of them say no, it won't get cancelled. So that's the hope of people, Greens and industries in the US at least, is that this thing is kind of bulletproof. It's created winners in both parties, and it's not going to get cancelled. But at the same time, there'll be this uncertainty. Will it? Won't it? And it'll be a year of uncertainty. And in that uncertainty, some investors are going to stop their projects. All of these battery investments, solar panel investments might just get stalled or stopped. And so there won't be as much make in America, but American consumers and firms still want those green goods not being made in America, so It'll be made somewhere else.
Yeah.
And that's a big opportunity for developing countries. It's a big opportunity for Mexico, for Brazil, for India, for the Europeans, for Chinese firms to sell these green goods to the Americans that the Americans are no longer making at home.
Yeah, Tim, that brings me to the question of developing countries. We know that the US is clearly on a war path with China economically and otherwise. What is a good strategy for developing countries to adopt, given China is also emerging as a supplier of green goods and the US is kind of receding as a hostile, uh, um, potentially a hostile foreign policy to come? Uh, Secondly, also for countries like India, how do they react, given that India is also a big trade partner of the US to this kind of development?
I mean, this is a big question because, the entire development over the last 40 years has happened in some sense in a peaceful time. I mean, obviously, it wasn't peaceful. We had giant wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and so on. But it wasn't the number of conflicts that have broken out and wars that have broken out in the last 2 or 3 years is now more wars than at any time since 1990, since the end of the Cold War. So the security environment has changed. The tariffs and the geoeconomic competition that you were talking about has changed. So there's a lot more protectionism than there was 5, 10, 15 years ago. There's a lot more wars than there was. And these questions of alignment, are you with us? Are you against us? Are developing countries can face sanctions from either the Americans or the Chinese or the Russians if they decide to align with the wrong guy. And so this has created a severe amount of stress on every economy and every country that they have to pick a side. And when you pick a side, you might want to pick a side for your security. India can say, look, we are really afraid of China and they're gobbling up parts of the Himalayas and we want to have more help from American technology, American military. We'll make a quad alliance with the Japanese and the Australians, and that will protect us against China. So that from a security point of view might make sense, but from an economic point of view, you're dealing with a country that is the largest manufacturer in the history of the world. It produces 50% of almost anything that you can name. And on green technologies, it's not 50%, it's 80% of almost all green verticals. Solar panels, batteries, wind turbines, electrolyzers, etc. So you just end up in a situation where this conflict between US and China is making countries pick sides. And in an ideal world, they shouldn't have to do that because they shouldn't have to put their climate goals and their development goals in tension with each other.
Final question. Outlook for 2025. What can we be hopeful about in 2025 as climate policy watchers? What do you think?
I think one big thing is just going to be the amount of technology transfer and technology fights that countries are engaged in. So going back to the Chinese are saying we want to start exporting our technology. And in the old term, that just meant, well, just buy these green goods from us. We're so good at making them, you should just buy them from us. But then developing countries have their own power. So Mexico and Brazil went to China, Indonesia went to China and said, no, we want your factories to be set up here. And then we will learn to make these green goods from your engineers, from your scientists, in the same way that we have done industrialization for the last 200 years, right? Like India invited a bunch of steel companies from Russia, from Britain, from the US to set up a factory in India. Then we learned from them and now we make our own steel. So in that sense, this new green industrialization era, led by a lead country, China, every developing country wants to attract them to their shores. So I think that technology policy is something that we really need to think about. Technology transfer, FDI, and negotiations about let's set up the factory here. Let's make sure more and more of the components for that green good is made inside India, Brazil, etc. That's one thing to look forward to. And I think the second thing to look forward to is what the hell happens with the global debt crisis. Interest rates are still very high. They're at sky high rates. And those interest rates basically have been creating debt explosions everywhere in the world. And we really need to, and that basically means developing countries get borrowing is more expensive, everything is more expensive, so they can't invest in anything. Forget green, they can't invest in health, they can't invest in education. They are under massive debt burdens. So we really need to think about what policy happens inside the United States because the United States sets the global interest rate.
Yeah.
And that could, we don't know what that's going to happen. Is that going to make the problem worse or going to make the problem better? Depends on where the interest rate goes.
So the aspect to be hopeful about on this is that there's more conversation about this now. I mean,
There's a lot. You guys were at the COP, right? That was the entire conversation.
I mean, the debt crisis has come into the climate discussion in a very, very big way, which is promising. What we're actually probably not seeing at this point are actual transformative, multilaterally determined solutions to kind of just cancel it all or figure out a better debt relief.
The Pope and the Vatican have been all about debt relief. So they have said 2025 is the year of the debt jubilee. So they've launched a debt jubilee campaign. This is what happened in 2004, Jubilee campaign. You need more supporters. You need more countries willing to put up and say, yes, we can't live like this. We can't keep cutting up budgets for people's food and energy and healthcare because we have to pay our creditors enormous interest payments. And so that is a zone where we think debt relief is on the table, meaning it's something that we need to fight for. And then the second big way in which countries can pay off, can pay for their energy and climate transition is raising taxes. So we're going to have tax fights in every country.
Yep.
And if I view that, that can be good or bad depending upon who's being taxed. Is it a regressive tax or a progressive tax?
Yeah.
But the developing countries are not just dirt poor, right? A lot of them have a lot of billionaires like we do, and they should be taxed.
So, so given that, I mean, so much of the in terms of the solution to really tackling the climate crisis is really about reorganizing economies and literally like changing machinery in factories and changing the appliances we use and stuff like that. I think what I'm really interested to understand is what is the way forward for developing countries to forge their place in the new global green economy, which is quite unique. I mean, it's characterized by not hydrocarbons, but by minerals, by abundant renewable sources of energy. So it's a different type of economy. And we have China, the US, the European Union already kind of taking a lead in building up some of that green industrial base for themselves and capturing that new green economy. How does the global south actually catch up, keep a pace? How do they build their own green industrialization?
I honestly think this is one of the biggest questions of what does development look like in the 21st century under all of these pressures. And the fear in many developing countries that we talk to, they all have the same fear. They fear the return of colonialism, neo-colonialism.
Yeah.
And what does that mean? That basically means the colonial world looked like the cotton comes out from India and then we buy the t-shirts from England, right?
Yeah.
So the raw material comes out of the south, it's sent to the industrial region, it's turned into a finished good, and then that poor developing countries just buys the finished good. And if the green transition takes this shape, where the winners are concentrated in the north, and China is now very much, not just the north, but the leading country in the north on the green transition, then does that mean that all developing countries return to the pattern of unequal exchange of colonialism? And so they basically said, no, we can't have that. We need to do something different. And the something different is we want to prevent that colonialism by having a technology. So we want to invite some of these leading American, Chinese, European, Japanese, Korean firms to India or to Africa or to Brazil. And then we want to make sure that you are making those goods here so that we aren't just buying them. And then the thing that they really don't want to do is just be a producer of raw materials.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, from the point of view of the North, they look like, well, you guys have all of these raw materials. What if you don't give it to us? What if you blockade them? So it's kind of like a negotiation between two sides. One side might have the technology, but another side might have the materials. And that's the basis for a negotiated deal. And I think the best illustration of that was Indonesia. Indonesia just said, we are going to ban the exports of raw nickel, raw metals. If you want a nickel, come and set up your factory here.
Yeah.
And the Chinese factories said, fine, we'll do that.
Right.
The American and European factories tried to do that. So the Indonesians got that technology in return for access to their raw materials. And so you could find, plays like that for some developing countries to do. And I think the other thing is no country gets investment unless they have a market to sell it to. A country that is big enough like India can, 80-90% of the stuff that it produces will be consumed
Yeah.
domestically. We have a large domestic market. In fact, that's one of the attractions for why other countries want to do trade deals with India, right? They say you're a growing economy, you're a large economy, second, third largest, rise of middle class, blah, blah, blah. So you're going to be buying stuff, and we want to have our firms sell into your market.
Yeah.
What are your conditions for access in your market? So big countries like India, Brazil can play that kind of game, or Indonesia. But some of the smaller developing countries, they don't really have a big market to access. So what they need to do is create a larger regional market.
Yeah.
Stitch together a Latin American club like the EU or an African Union kind of club, so they can say, look, we aren't just a bunch of small players that you can pick off one at a time. We are going to collectively negotiate access to our market. We're going to collectively make things with a regional supply chain, or we are going to collectively have a regional market. So that is what can give them some extra heft and pull in these negotiations.
Right. So definitely. And I think then what that really calls for is the pathway to green industrialization doesn't look the same for every country of the South. And this is something we just read Amar Lebdoui's Survival of the Greenest, in which he actually talks about how you have large developing countries with large domestic markets that can actually soak up some of that production. But does that mean everybody everywhere in the world needs to produce all of the solar panels for domestic or global consumption? What about commodity heavy countries who actually produce more agricultural goods? What about countries with different, resource endowments? So it's going to look different for different parts of the developing world. And I think, yeah, that's for me like an interesting part of the challenge.
Yeah, and I think like if you look at the IEA's numbers for how much this green value chain in solar batteries, wind, electrolyzers is going to grow over the next 10 years, it's going to go to, it's currently 10% of global growth. So it's going to grow a lot more in the next 10 years. And so then the question becomes, who's going to be getting a slice of this green pie? This green pie is getting much, much bigger. And so one of the things that I really, you guys have done such a fantastic job on is looking at particular policies like what the Europeans have done on a penalty on carbon goods.
Yeah.
What does that mean? I mean, I'm just asking you, what does that mean for a country, for a developing country that is going to face that penalty?
Yeah. So we did a report on the EU CBAM. It's a carbon border adjustment policy where the European Union basically puts a price on the carbon that is emitted during the production of the products that the EU imports. And these are the products that are mostly supplied by developing countries to the EU, like India, China, and some of the Latin American countries like Brazil, also South Africa, and other African countries which are huge suppliers of iron ore to the EU. Now, this tax burden falls disproportionately on these countries because, one, they are heavily dependent on exports to the EU, and secondly, the intensity, the carbon intensity of their production is quite bad. So the tax is disproportionately going to impact such countries, and this is
And the Europeans say this is just the price of entry into our market. If you want to enter our market, it better be great.
exactly. And the fear is that more and more countries are going to adopt this kind of policy, which will really create sort of a barrier of trade for developing countries which are supplying raw materials to many of the developed countries.
And does the EU then say, okay, we've created a problem for you, but we're also going to help you with the solution?
So far, the EU has not shown a sort of a friendly gesture towards this kind of mechanism that is being developed between the countries, because one thing is that the European Union essentially came out with a unilateral trade measure.
So they didn't sit around and collaborate and negotiate it. Okay. I mean, this is one of the things that I think, going back to what does the Trump shock mean for the rest of the world? For the Europeans, it's going to be a big shock because they have no climate coalition with the US anymore. The US is a climate denialist, oil and gas producing, tariff hurting, Europeans. So they're like going to seek more relationships and alliances with the global south and with China. We expect that over the coming years. So maybe they're going to sit down on a table and come up with some of these new instruments, new pots of money, new technology transfers, new FDI, whatever it is that they come up with. And if they don't come up with that, maybe the CBAM just dies.
Yeah.
I mean, that's,
It could. There's so much opposition from the South. There's so much opposition from European publics from these new taxes, carbon taxes, and those are the two kind of scenarios. You either make new pots of money collaboratively, or there's so much opposition that the this dies.
absolutely. And that's not completely impossible or just completely outlandish to think about. I mean, initially, for the first few months of the CBAM, the European delegations were completely incredulous. They couldn't believe that there was this kind of backlash to what they essentially perceived to be a good faith global decarbonization spurring tool. But there was a huge backlash. I mean, that's one of the reasons we also did this report, to provide a strong global south response. And at the same time, and soon after that, South Africa, India, China, then the BRICS, then at COP, the basic countries, then at COP, the G77, the biggest bloc of developing countries, came out with extremely strong statements at COP, outside of COP, to say that this is going to hurt our development, and this is an undue burden that we should not have to bear. So those calls for, kind of cancelling the CBAM or whatever aren't going to go away. They're going to escalate from here. So the Europeans will really have to think about how they can have a more cooperative and assisted kind of approach to this transition. I think that's something that we hope will happen. Coming to countries of the global south, once again, what we have seen, and we follow the climate summits, which are kind of a very specific distillation of what's happening in the larger world. So the global geopolitics do play out in a very similar way in the very controlled COP experimental environment. And this time at COP29, there was solidarity amongst the G77, over 130 developing countries demanding $500 billion of public money from developed countries. We didn't get that. We got a really bad deal at the end of it. But that really makes me think about this question of how do we see more of that South-South solidarity, where we are, as you said, moving towards a world where there's like neo-green colonialism potentially rising. How do we form these strong South coalitions that will fight for one another, as opposed to kind of breaking away and thinking of their own domestic self-interest, which you wouldn't really blame them for. They have to trade, they have to, earn export revenues from developed countries. But how do we still kind of build these coalitions? Is BRICS the place, or how does this happen?
I mean, we've seen a lot of coalitions emerge over the last 20, 30 years. This is not a new thing. There's just more South and South trade.
Yeah.
Because they're becoming richer. When we say rise of multipolarity, what we mean is a bunch of developing countries have gotten richer. They have bigger producers, bigger consumers, so they trade more with each other. So South-South trade has been increasing. 20 years ago, the Americans or the Europeans were the largest trade partner of most countries. Now you look at any country's largest trade partner and it's either China or some other neighboring country. So it's not necessary that like you only look for relationships with the Europeans and the Americans. You also have increasing South-South trade, technology, etc. And so if you think about what happened with the pharma and the AIDS vaccine, not the vaccine, the retroviral drugs for AIDS, Brazilians, Indians, South Africans coordinated on making low-cost retroviral drugs available for their people, saying we don't want to die from this virus. We want to make our own drugs and give them to our people. And, that's how the Indian, South African, Brazilian pharmaceutical sectors have emerged. They're large producers of low-cost drugs and treatments for the world. So can that kind of club emerge for green stuff? That's a question, and that there's a push to make that happen. And we're basically seeing like these three big developing parts of the world. Asia, Southeast Asia in particular, is making a lot of solar panels and batteries. The Africans have an enormous amount of solar potential and wind potential, so they can make very cheap electricity.
Cool.
So they're looking for imports of solar panels from China. And the Chinese are saying, okay, we need to export our lead technologies to you. We are going to set up factories in Africa to exploit this solar potential. And so maybe they get a lot of cheap green electricity. And when you look at these models, Africa becomes a place where green hydrogen can be made very cheaply. And so maybe you can use that green hydrogen to kickstart African green industrialization. And then in Latin America, you have all of these clubs of Latin American countries forming, where they are like, we should have a lithium OPEC. There's lithium in Chile, there's lithium in Argentina, there's lithium in Brazil, but then the big buyers are going to be the car manufacturers and the battery manufacturers and the consumers in the two big countries, Brazil and Argentina. So we are producers, consumers, let's form a club together to make and use our lithium and turn them into batteries and turn them into industrial potential. So I think these clubs are going to form, and it's very interesting to see what shape they get as the Americans become sort of the bad problem child for the rest of the world. And so the Europeans are forced together with the South is forced together with each other, and I think we're just going to find a lot more collaboration.
We've talked specifically through the lens of geopolitical coalitions, countries, North versus South. I'm going to now flip the last question to, specific sectors. And you have a really good summary of this, where you and Kate in the Polycrisis talked about how cash, corn, chemicals, and cars, it's nice alliteration, are really at the center of the decarbonization conundrum. Can you talk a little more about that?
Sure, yeah. Cash, corn, chemicals, and cars, we said, are these big decarbonization kind of narrative plots going on. And the reason we said that is that if you think about decarbonization, if you think about, we created a fossil fuel civilization, that is a fossil fuel civilization of hydrocarbons.
Yeah.
And those hydrocarbons are oil, gas, and coal. And we are going to create this new green civilization. And that green civilization is a civilization of metals. We take those metals out and we turn them into magic metals that take sunlight and make electricity out of it, right? Silicon PV is like a chip. It is magic. Like it's 100 years old technology, but it still blows my mind that you take light and it makes electricity. Another big metal that we are using is all of this stuff in batteries. It's that nickel, it's that lithium, it's that the biggest part of the battery is graphite. All of these things are just rocks lying there, and then we use our brains and our research and our technology and convert it into these incredibly refined, processed material that can do magical things like store energy or make electricity. And so what we were trying to say is that as you switch from this hydrocarbon world into this metal world, you're going to get a new sets of winners and losers. Yeah. And everyone knows that there's going to be some winners and there's going to be some losers. And the interesting thing is all of these oil economies, the Gulf kingdoms in particular, they are very worried about losing their oil and gas sales, not now, but 20 years from now, 30 years from now. And so they are investing in these new metal processing. They're investing in new energy economies. The Gulf kingdoms are some of the largest, both attracting green firms into the Gulf kingdoms and exporting that money and so on. So that's this question about how hydrocarbon wealth is being used to generate and invest into the new sort of green sectors. And then the big question around corn. Why is corn seems like the odd man out in that, right? Okay, I get coal, yes, I get cash. You want to take dollars and turn them into, invest them into the green sectors. What's this corn doing in there? And the corn business is, if you go to a petrol pump in India, 10% of that petrol is ethanol.
Yeah.
So it's ethanol made from sugarcane, from rice, from whatever. In Brazil, that number can be 50%, 80% of that petrol is coming from sugarcane ethanol. In America, by law, 15% of that petrol has to come from corn.
Right.
Has to come from corn-based ethanol. So the agribusiness economy or the agricultural economy is a huge part of this transition.
Right.
Mhm.
And what we wanted to say was, don't forget about these agricultural interests, because we keep thinking about this new stuff or the fossil fuel world, but the agricultural world will remain a very powerful source of problem, source of the solution. And there's definitely mixed opinions on whether ethanol is a good thing or a bad thing for the energy transition. But one of the big plot points now is, okay, we are feeding our cars with corn. How about we feed our planes with corn?
Yeah.
So cars, we seem to have a solution. That's electric vehicles. How about we just do that? Most countries are switching from petrol to electric vehicles, but Brazil says, no, 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 we have our own solution, which is ethanol cars. We are not going to do batteries. But almost everybody else is going to do batteries. But then the big question becomes, who's going to feed the planes? The planes take kerosene. The kerosene is one of the byproducts from a refinery. Over the next 30 years, the only green solution we have for planes is, quote, sustainable aviation fuel. It's just, you take that ethanol,
Comes from ethanol.
you take that ethanol and you turn it in jet fuel. So synthetically, in the Fischer-Tropsch process, you convert it into jet fuel and you feed the planes. So now imagine all these vast millions of acres of grasslands in India, in Indonesia, in South Africa, in Brazil, being converted to grow corn or to grow sugarcane, to turn them into ethanol, to feed the planes instead of the cars. So we basically wanted to put the land question back, the question about food or fuel.
Yeah.
And that's a difficult question. And you're seeing India and Brazil in particular are putting up their hands and saying, we want to be a part of this new biofuel economy and a biofuel coalition. And the farmers love that. The farmers get a minimum support price because some entity is going to buy their rice or corn or sugarcane, convert it into ethanol, and that gives them more income. And the basic point being, do not forget the agricultural economy in this transition. So that's the cars and chemicals, cash and corn.
Interesting.
Amazing. Cool. So very interesting. So cash, corn, chemicals, and cars. I think that wraps up this very far-ranging conversation we've had today, where we've gone 10,000 feet up in the air, but also come down extremely to the granular level. And that's really a lot of what the climate policy landscape is about. Thinking about the big, where you have these top-down targets that are set, but then at the implementation scale on the ground, there's all of these challenges. There's trade rivalries, there's developmental goals, there's access to lack of abundance of resources, all of these complications at the ground level. So I think that's what we're navigating as we go forward into 2025, looking at climate policy. I will remind everybody once again, it's not just about target setting and mitigation versus adaptation. We have to think about, as you've pointed out in such a nuanced way, how do developing countries actually participate in this new global green economy? And how do they do that with the US on a warpath with China? How do they actually form meaningful coalitions amongst themselves where needed to actually push back against some of the traditional hegemonic neocolonial tendencies? And really, how do they kind of build a role for themselves in this new global green economy? I think that's going to be the interesting challenge going forward. So thank you so much once again. And this was incredibly interesting. And follow Tim on Twitter at 70s Bachchan. Read the Polycrisis newsletter and dispatch.
And read every single one of CSE's reports. I can't tell you how useful they are, just explaining what is going on.
Yes, thank you, for being such a champion of our work. Thank you for joining us.